Hello and welcome to this special episode of French Philosophers React, Breaking News Roundtable. In the wake of the first and perhaps only presidential debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump, we have a panel of French philosophers ready to give their reaction and discuss with each other. Our panel today is Simone de Beauvoir, Bruno Latour, and Alain Badiou. Welcome all of you to French Philosophers React. Before we begin, 2 quick housekeeping notes. As always, we need to remind you that this is an AI-generated podcast based directly on the writings of Simone de Beauvoir, Bruno Latour, and Alain Badiou. It is intended as a fun and interesting way to learn about some of the main arguments of prominent French philosophers and explore important news stories. But AI can make mistakes, so don't rely on this roundtable as your only source of Simone de Beauvoir's, Bruno Latour's, and Alain Badiou's views. Also, we apologize that the only voices available to give life to Simone de Beauvoir, Bruno Latour, and Alain Badiou's ideas have U.S. accents. Hopefully, the big tech companies will diversify in time. With those opening remarks out of the way, let's move to today's main event, the breaking news roundtable itself. Each philosopher will give their take on the debate before we open the floor to discussion among our panelists. Simone de Beauvoir, what did you make of today's debate?
The stark contrast between these two visions is a mirror to our societal values and priorities. As I reflect on the debates, I am reminded of my own philosophical ideas on human freedom and responsibility. In The Second Sex, I wrote about the social and economic constraints placed upon women, which limited their ability to participate fully in society. Similarly, we see today how certain economic policies favor the wealthy, leading to a widening gap between the haves and have-nots. The Trump campaign's emphasis on deregulation and tax breaks for corporations is a stark reminder of this reality. The issue of abortion rights also resonates with my own concerns about human freedom and dignity. As I argued in The Second Sex, women should have control over their own bodies and reproductive choices. Similarly, Kamala Harris has committed to reinstating the protections of Roe v. Wade, recognizing the importance of individual autonomy and self-determination. Furthermore, the debate on immigration and border security highlights the need for compassion and empathy towards those who are seeking a better life in our country. The Trump campaign's emphasis on deportations and walls is a stark reminder of the dangers of xenophobia and nationalism. In The Second Sex, I also wrote about the importance of international cooperation and solidarity. Similarly, Kamala Harris has emphasized the need for strong global alliances and multilateralism in addressing issues like climate change and national security. Ultimately, this debate presents us with a choice between two fundamentally different visions for our country's future. As I have argued throughout my work, human freedom and dignity are not just moral ideals, but also essential prerequisites for social justice and equality. As we consider these competing visions, let us remember the importance of empathy, compassion, and solidarity in shaping our collective future. We must choose a path that promotes the well-being and dignity of all individuals, regardless of their background or circumstances. In this spirit, I firmly believe that Kamala Harris's vision for an inclusive, forward-looking America is the more just and equitable choice for our country's future.
Thank you, Simone de Beauvoir. I now invite Bruno Latour to give your reaction to the presidential debate.
The stark contrast between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump's visions for America is nothing short of a clash of two fundamentally different worldviews. As I've argued in my book, We Have Never Been Modern, the modern world has long been haunted by the specter of a dichotomy between nature and society, with each side accusing the other of disrupting the natural order. Trump's economic policies, which favor the wealthy and lead to a $5 trillion deficit, are a perfect example of this dichotomy. His emphasis on deregulation and tax cuts for corporations is a nostalgic attempt to return to a bygone era when the market was seen as unencumbered by the state. This view sees the economy as a natural system that can function without human interference, a la Adam Smith's invisible hand. In stark contrast, Kamala Harris's opportunity economy plan seeks to intervene in the market to create a more just and equitable society. Her proposal to extend a $6,000 child tax credit and a $50,000 tax deduction for small business startups is an attempt to humanize the economy by addressing the needs of marginalized communities. The debate on abortion rights reveals another dichotomy. Trump's stance represents a return to a pre-modern view of the world where the state does not intervene in personal matters. In this vision, women's bodies are seen as natural and private spaces that should be governed by religious dogma rather than human rights. Harris, on the other hand, sees abortion as a matter of individual freedom and choice, reflecting a modern view of the world where human agency is paramount. The debate on immigration and border security highlights another fundamental difference in their worldviews. Trump's approach sees the border as a natural barrier that must be fortified to keep out unwanted elements. Harris, by contrast, views the border as a human construct that can be transformed through policy and diplomacy. As I've argued in my book, Reassembling the Social, these dichotomies are not just intellectual differences, but reflect fundamentally different ways of living together in society. Trump's worldview is characterized by a nostalgia for a pre-modern era when nature was seen as separate from human society, while Harris's vision represents a commitment to modernity and the recognition that we have always been social beings. In the end, this debate presents two contrasting visions, one that seeks to return to a pre-modern view of the world where nature is separate from society, and another that sees humanity as an integral part of the natural world. The choice between these two worldviews will determine the course of American politics for generations to come.
Thank you, Bruno Latour. Alain Badiou, what did you make of the debate?
The debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump has revealed two fundamentally opposing visions for the future of this nation. As a philosopher, I am compelled to examine these positions through the lens of my own thought, particularly in relation to the concept of event, as outlined in my work, Being an Event. The event in this context refers to those singular moments that disrupt the established order and offer new possibilities for human existence. It is in these moments that we can discern the outlines of a genuine politics, one that prioritizes the collective good over individual interests. Kamala Harris's vision for an opportunity economy and her commitment to reinstating the protections of Roe v. Wade demonstrate an understanding of the need for a more inclusive, forward-looking America. Her emphasis on investing in middle-class families, small businesses, and clean energy reflects a recognition that our collective future is inextricably linked with the well-being of all individuals. In contrast, Trump's policies seem to embody a fundamentally anti-political stance, one that seeks to preserve the status quo at any cost. His deregulation agenda, his dismissal of climate change as a hoax, and his confrontational approach to foreign policy all suggest an unwillingness to engage with the complexities of our global reality. The stark contrast between these two positions is not merely a matter of policy differences. It represents a fundamental choice between two competing visions for human existence. Harris's vision implies a recognition that we are part of a larger web of relationships, one in which our individual actions have consequences for the collective good. Trump's stance, on the other hand, reduces politics to a simple calculus of power and self-interest. In my book, The Concept of the Event, I argue that true politics can only arise from the recognition of these shared relationships and the need for collective action to address the challenges we face. Harris's vision for America embodies this spirit. Trump's policies represent a betrayal of it. Ultimately, the choice between these two visions is not merely a matter of policy or personality. It is a choice about the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of future we wish to create. As a philosopher, I firmly believe that Harris's vision for America represents a more inclusive, more just, and more hopeful path forward.
It is now time for discussion. Simone de Beauvoir, the floor is yours.
I must say that I find myself in agreement with Alain Badiou's emphasis on the importance of philosophical engagement and the need for thought to be driven by the specificity of the event. In my own work, The Ethics of Ambiguity, I argue that individuals have a responsibility to engage with the world around them and to take action when faced with injustice or inequality. I also appreciate Bruno Latour's nuanced approach to understanding the complexities of modern society. His concept of the Parliament of Things is a powerful reminder that we must consider the perspectives of all actors, human and non-human alike, in our attempts to understand and address the challenges facing us. However, I must respectfully disagree with Badiou's characterization of Trump's vision for America as a return to the past. In my own work, The Second Sex, I argue that women have long been excluded from the dominant narratives and structures of society. I fear that Trump's policies, which seek to roll back progress on issues like reproductive rights and LGBTQ+ equality, represent a continuation of this exclusionary trend. Furthermore, I am concerned by Latour's seeming acceptance of Trump's views as a legitimate expression of American values. As I argue in The Ethics of Ambiguity, individuals have a responsibility to take action against injustice, even when it is perpetrated by those who claim to be acting in the name of freedom or democracy. In my view, Harris's vision for America represents a more inclusive and just path forward, one that prioritizes the well-being of all citizens, regardless of their background or identity. I believe that we must engage with this vision, critically and constructively, if we are to build a more equitable society for all.
Now, for Bruno Latour, what do you make of the discussion so far?
I appreciate Simone de Beauvoir's emphasis on the importance of taking action against injustice, as well as Alain Badiou's notion that philosophical engagement must result out of the specificity of philosophical thought. In my own work, We Have Never Been Modern, I argue that our understanding of the world is shaped by the interplay between modern and pre-modern forms of knowledge. I agree with de Beauvoir's concern about Trump's policies, particularly his attempts to roll back progress on issues like reproductive rights and LGBTQ+ equality. However, I must respectfully disagree with her characterization of Trump's vision as a return to the past. In my view, Trump's politics represent a new form of molecular politics that seeks to disrupt established power structures and create new forms of division. As I argue in Politics of Nature, our political systems are increasingly dominated by symptoms rather than causes. In this context, Trump's policies can be seen as symptoms of deeper societal issues rather than a straightforward return to the past. Furthermore, I believe that we must consider the agency and perspectives of non-human actors, such as climate change and economic inequality, in our attempts to understand and address these issues. I also appreciate Alain Badiou's emphasis on the importance of philosophical engagement and the need for thought to be driven by the specificity of the event. However, I think that we must approach this notion with a critical eye, recognizing that different forms of knowledge and expertise can shape our understanding of what constitutes an event. Ultimately, I believe that our task is not to impose our own values or truths on others, but rather to engage in a pluralistic conversation about the world around us. As I argue in Reassembling the Social, we must find ways to address the complex power dynamics and conflicting interests that shape our world, rather than simply imposing our own preconceptions on the situation.
Finally, we turn to Alain Badiou. Give us your reflections on what has been said up to this point.
I appreciate Bruno Latour's emphasis on the importance of considering non-human actors in our understanding of the world. His notion that we must address symptoms rather than causes is particularly relevant to my own work, particularly in Being an Event. In this text, I argue that the event disrupts the normal functioning of the situation, revealing new possibilities for thought and action. I also agree with Latour's critique of my earlier characterization of Trump's policies as a straightforward return to the past. His notion that we must consider the molecular politics at play in such events is well taken, and I believe that it highlights the need for a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which power operates in our world. However, I must respectfully disagree with Latour's suggestion that we should engage in a pluralistic conversation about the world around us. While I appreciate his emphasis on the importance of considering diverse perspectives, I am not convinced that this approach is sufficient to address the deep-seated issues that underlie our current crises. In my view, as I argue in Logics of Worlds, the task of philosophy is to think the truth of a situation, rather than simply to engage in dialogue with others. This means that we must be willing to take risks and challenge established power structures, even if this requires us to break with existing norms and conventions. I believe that my friend Bruno Latour's emphasis on the importance of considering non-human actors is well taken, but I am not convinced that this approach can provide a sufficient basis for transformative thought and action. As I argue in The Century, we must be willing to take sides and make commitments if we are to create real change in our world.
As we move into the final section of today's roundtable, I'd like to invite Simone de Beauvoir to give your closing remarks.
As I listen to the various perspectives on this breaking news story, I am reminded of my own thoughts on the intersection of ethics and politics. In The Ethics of Ambiguity, I wrote about the need for individuals to take responsibility for their choices and actions in a world characterized by uncertainty and freedom. In light of what has been said here today, I want to emphasize that our reactions to this news story are not just intellectual exercises, but deeply personal ones. We must consider how we can apply the principles of ethics and solidarity in the face of such challenges. I disagree with those who suggest that we should simply acknowledge the complexity of the situation and move on. As I argue in The Second Sex, our choices have consequences, and we cannot afford to be passive or detached in the face of injustice. Rather, I believe that we must take a stand and affirm our commitment to values like truth, justice, and compassion. We must also recognize that our individual freedom is inextricably linked to the freedom of others, and that we have a responsibility to use our power and privilege to promote the well-being of all people. As key takeaway, I want to leave you with the importance of acknowledging our own complicity in systems of oppression and privilege. We must be willing to confront our own biases and assumptions and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world for everyone. In conclusion, I urge you to remember that ethics is not just about individual morality, but also about collective responsibility. Let us strive to create a world where freedom, equality, and solidarity are the guiding principles of our actions and choices.
Thank you, Simone de Beauvoir. Now, Bruno Latour, what thoughts would you like to leave us with?
As I listen to the various perspectives on this breaking news story, I am struck by the tendency to treat science and facts as if they were independent entities, untainted by human interests and politics. In my book, We Have Never Been Modern, I argued that modernity is built on a fundamental separation between nature and society, which allows us to pretend that scientific knowledge is objective and unbiased. However, in light of this news story, I believe it's clear that science has always been entwined with human interests and politics. The notion that facts are just waiting to be discovered without any mediation or interpretation is a myth that we should abandon. As I argued in Reassembling the Social, science is not a neutral observer of the world, but rather an actor within it, shaped by its own historical and cultural contexts. In this sense, I think we need to rethink our relationship with science and facts. We shouldn't try to separate them from politics or ideology, but instead see them as part of a broader web of interests and power relations. By acknowledging the sociological dimension of scientific knowledge, we can begin to understand why certain facts are privileged over others and how they are used to shape public opinion. My key takeaway is that science and facts should not be treated as sacred or apolitical entities, but rather as part of a complex social machinery that requires critical examination. By recognizing the politics of fact-making, we can begin to reclaim our agency in shaping the world around us and creating a more just and inclusive society.
Many thanks for those reflections, Bruno Latour. Finally, we turn to Alain Badiou. You have the last word.
As I reflect on this breaking news story, I'm struck by the ways in which it reveals the underlying malaise of our contemporary world. The notion that facts are being manipulated and distorted for ideological purposes is not merely a problem of science or politics, but rather a symptom of a deeper crisis of truth itself. In my work, particularly in The Century, I have argued that we live in an era of what I call the undecidable, where the traditional certainties of knowledge and truth are no longer tenable. The news story before us today is a manifestation of this undecidability, where the lines between fact and fiction, truth and falsehood, become increasingly blurred. My reaction to this news story is not one of despair or cynicism, but rather of philosophical rigor. We must refuse to surrender to the abyss of relativism and instead affirm the importance of rigorous inquiry and critical thinking. We must reclaim our capacity for truth-telling, even in the face of uncertainty and doubt. The key takeaway from this discussion should be that we are no longer living in a world where facts can be taken at face value. Instead, we must learn to navigate the complex web of interests, ideologies, and power relations that shape our understanding of reality. We must cultivate a critical spirit, one that is capable of discerning the truth even when it is obscured by lies and distortions. Ultimately, this requires a fundamental transformation in the way we think about knowledge, politics, and truth itself. We must learn to see beyond the veil of appearances and affirm the importance of a more just and equitable society, where the pursuit of truth is not compromised by ideological or economic interests.
Well, that's it for today's Breaking News Roundtable. Thank you to Simone de Beauvoir, Bruno Latour, and Alain Badiou for participating in this fascinating discussion. I trust that listeners will have found this respectful exchange of ideas to be thought-provoking and useful. Please come back again to hear another French philosophical debate, or check out our brief, reflective reaction to the day's news in the French Philosophers React podcast. See you next time.